Okay, so we did some playing around in the hallway last class, and we were just demonstrating how you could adjust your ambient light by using the shutter speed and ISO and the effect that they had on your subject. I only took 2 photos though, and then I became the model, so I didn't have all the samples I needed to complete the crib notes here. I had to do my own photos at home. Luckily, I found a willing participant, and first of all, they're not flattering photos, but I just took them really quick. So, because I just wanted to demonstrate how changing certain settings on your camera during on-camera flash photography affects your photos and your camera. So the first 2 shots I took on shutter speed priority, and the white balance on my camera was set to flash. The shutter speed I chose was the 60th of a second, and I started at ISO 200. The camera then decided that f4 was appropriate to expose for Paul, and this was the result. Before I took the second shot, I changed the ISO to 400 but did nothing else. So I was still on shutter speed priority at a 60th of a second. And as you can see, the camera still took the shot at f4 because that was the proper exposure for Paul. The difference here is that there's more ambient light in the background. Now you can also see effects of the ambient light on Paul's shoulder and in his hair here a little bit. The overall photo is also starting to look a little too warm because of the ambient light being that it was tungsten and therefore producing that yellow hue. So you may think that it would stand to reason then that I should have taken the photo with tungsten white balance set on my camera. I can show you what that would have looked like here in Lightroom just by changing the white balance from as shot to tungsten. And what happens then is that the background looks better, but Paul is blue because he's mostly exposed by the flash, and the flash is giving off a more neutral light. It's actually balanced to daylight. So we learned in class that because tungsten light is yellow, the camera, or Lightroom as the case may be here, will add blue to balance it. Since the flash is more neutral, when Lightroom adds the blue, Paul looks blue. So the best idea here would be to white balance then off of Paul's shirt and then adjust manually to make it look exactly the way you want it to, because ultimately the subject is what matters. When you're trying to balance the flash with ambient light like tungsten, you just have to accept what the background gives you. Now with the next 3 shots here, I changed to manual just to demonstrate that it works the same way. I still used f4 because that's what the camera had determined the proper exposure to be for my subject when it was lit by the flash, and using 1/60th of a second. And because I knew that, if he moved, the ambient light would light him up enough to allow blurriness to happen. So I didn't want to drop below a 60th of a second. I'll explain the blurriness issues here shortly. So I started with ISO 200 and took the shot. Paul looks good, but it's that ugly head-on flattening flash with very little ambient light. So there's also a sharp shadow on the wall behind him here because the camera, the flash, and the subject and the wall are all lined up. So there's nowhere else for the shadow to go. With the flash on your camera, you'll find that you'll get a shadow on the wall even if the subject is quite a distance away from the wall. As your flash puts out enough power to reach the wall, the shadow will happen. If you're able to put a flash off to the side, either by using a strobe or second speed light, or actually another technique I'm also going to demonstrate here shortly, the shadow will fall off to the opposite side of the flash and therefore out of your frame. Now for the next shot, I bumped up the ISO to 400 and it's looking a little better. Paul is still exposed properly because the aperture is all that affects the exposure of the flash. But now we have more ambient light, and Paul is filled in with a little ambient light, and the shadow behind him is now softer because the flash is not the only light source we can see. The ambient light is able to take some of the harshness out of that shadow. Now in the next shot, aperture and shutter speed still remain the same, but I bumped up the ISO to 800. Again, Paul is exposed properly. The shadow on the wall is softer still, and we have even more ambient light to give a little more dimension than just the flattening effect of the camera on-camera flash. So now again, the overall look is very warm because the ambient light has more of an effect on our subject. We already learned that we can't just change the white balance to tungsten because the subject mainly lit by the flash, which is more neutral. Um, Changing it to tungsten, white balance would add blue. It would be good for the background, but not for Paul. So we could white balance from his shirt again and then adjust if necessary. Again, we just have to accept what the background gives us under tungsten lights. Since our flashes are balanced to daylight, using your flash outside wouldn't be a problem. Your subject is going to look more balanced with the background. You'd also therefore just use your daylight white balance on your camera and you'd be fine, especially if you're just using your flash or fill. Now the next 3 shots, instead of changing my ISO, I changed my shutter speed. The same thing happens, sort of. I left my ISO at 200 for all 3 shots. My aperture at f4, well, I accidentally switched to 4.5 for the next 2 shots, which isn't a big deal anyway, but I just moved the wheel with my finger while adjusting something else and looking through the lens at the same time. So no biggie, but the shutter speed I used was a 60th of a second. So in the first shot, the only light falling on Paul was the flash, so I got that flat head-on flash look, and you can see the shadow on the post behind him. It was a good 10 feet away from that post, or he was a good 10 feet away, but because the flash put out enough light to expose Paul, and it was strong enough to also hit the post, we got the shadow. So now for that second shot, I changed to a 30th of a second. Still the same exposure on Paul, but more ambient light in the background and also a softer shadow behind him. Now, because he's not moving, we don't really have a blurriness issue at a 30th of a second. If he was dancing or something else, moving somehow, it could be an issue. In the third shot, I changed to a 15th of a second. Again, same exposure on Paul, because the aperture is the only thing controlling the flash, but even more ambient light in the background and an even softer shadow on the post. So here's where you see even the effects of either his breathing, though, or my unsteady hand. If we zoom in, you can see a bit of ghosting happening around him because the ambient light is starting to take more of a role in lighting him. And while the flash froze him at the time that it went off, the shutter was open for longer, and what we're seeing is him as he was when he was exposed by the ambient light. So again, we have the overall warm hue, but we can balance it somewhat again by white balancing off his shirt and adjusting if necessary, because it is a white shirt with no color cast. So now I took some photos of my son Hayden, and he looks absolutely thrilled here. I took them during the day inside with no room lights on, and I had the window light behind him and off to the right, which made for a great rim light on his shoulder there. There's also a window up high just a little behind me and to the right, and then of course there was another window at the other end of the room. I also had a reflector to the right of him, or to my left here. The photo was taken without flash and on aperture priority, so I chose f4 because I also used ISO 100 and I needed the widest aperture possible for my lens that I could get. ISO 100 is almost at the bottom of the scale and is one of the least light sensitive, so I took the shot, but the camera needed a 15th of a second to expose it properly because it's trying to expose for the ambient light in the room, for the whole thing. So it's not bad as far as the fill light goes and that sort of thing, but he's blurry because of the slow shutter speed. I had him swinging kind of back and forth slightly too, just to amplify the issue so I could demonstrate something you can most definitely run into. If I were to introduce flash, I could bump up the shutter speed and still get a nice exposure. Now, the other thing I did in the next couple of shots to avoid that flat head-on flash look was to actually bounce my flash off the reflector instead of pointing it straight at him. So anyone can do that with one of those, articulating speed lights. As long as you can change the direction that it's pointing, you can bounce it off of anything else and therefore create an off-camera flash. So that's what you see in this next shot. Even though my flash was still mounted on my camera, I was able to achieve that off-camera effect. But I was still in aperture priority. The camera still used the 15th of a second to expose for the ambient light, and he is again blurry because of, number one, the slow shutter speed, and two, he's moving quite a bit more, and the ambient light in the room is exposing him quite a bit when the flash is on. So if I zoom in, you'll actually see that his one eye is fairly sharp because of the short flash duration, but the overall look is quite blurry because of the ambient light in the room. Now for the third shot, I switched to manual, still using f4 and ISO 100, but changed my shutter speed to a 60th of a second. I knew that it was going to cut down my ambient light, but I needed that to stop his motion, so it worked very well actually. 1/60th of a second isn't a great stop motion shutter speed, but when your subject is posing for you, even though they may be moving slightly, it's enough. So I actually had him swaying back and forth here a bit. Keep in mind, you have to choose the proper focus mode. If your subject is moving somewhat, you'd be better to use AI servo on a Canon or continuous servo on a Nikon so that it will track the subject, because if we look closer here, you'll see that I used one-shot focus, and because he was swaying, it was easy to miss the focus. His ear is sharp, but not his eyes. But his ear is sharp, so I know that it was just a matter of, misfocus and not anything because of the shutter speed or anything like that. So again, I bounced the flash off the reflector to his right, effectively creating a makeshift off-camera flash. He's sharp, or his ear is sharp, because of the shutter speed, but with the amount of light coming in from the window behind him and to his left, I was able to achieve this really nice rim light, and there's still quite a bit of ambient light in the background. So now these next two shots are also great examples of why you might want to adjust your shutter speed or ISO to allow for more ambient light. There's no doubt that allowing ambient light into your flash photography makes for a more pleasing result, or at least, the on-camera flash. It gets rid of that kind of head-on flattening effect. So the first shot here was taken on shutter speed priority, which I set at 1/200th of a second, and the camera determined that f4 was good to expose this armoire in my shot. Yeah, it looks kind of junky, but hey, it was a cooperating model, so the result is okay, but again, it's very flat because of the on-camera flash. So we've got hard shadows, and it's just very blah overall. So the second shot, I switched to aperture priority so I could dial in the f4 that the camera determined to be the proper exposure for my subject, and therefore the shutter speed dipped down to a 15th of a second because you're telling the camera to expose for the background when you're using aperture priority and letting the flash take care of the fill for your subject. It's really a great tool when you want a more natural look in your flash photography. So the result is obviously much more visually pleasing in the second image because you've got more dimension created by the use of the two light sources, the window light and the flash. You've also got softer shadows. And now I was hand holding the shutter speed was a 15th of a second, so it was a tad blurry. It would have been wise to, well, either put on a tripod or increase my ISO once I saw that it would dip down to a 15th of a second, and then that problem would have been solved. So I had said that your flash will freeze motion no matter what the shutter speed, which is true. The only thing that you need to worry about is the slower your shutter speed. If there's ambient light falling on your subject, the more the ambient light is going to light up your subject and you'll get blurriness. So part of your subject will be sharp because the flash froze it, but while the flash wasn't on, wherever the ambient light exposes your subject, you'll see the motion. This can create some cool effects, but it just depends on the look you're going for. In these next three shots here, I had some more control over the ambient light because I stood in the powder room in our house, which doesn't have any windows, and I didn't turn on the light. So I had Hayden stand facing into the bathroom with the natural light filling the hallway behind him. His face was dark because there wasn't any ambient light coming from the bathroom, and he had his back to the hallway. This would be a good comparison to taking a photo of someone at night in front of a building with lights, or say, Niagara Falls all lit up with your subject standing with you on the opposite side of the street, maybe in the park where it's fairly dark and there's no street lights. Again, I had Hayden swinging the back and forth so we could see the difference. The first shot was taken with a shutter speed of 1/20th of a second. Pretty slow, but there's lots of ambient light in the hallway, yet he was frozen because the flash was the only thing lighting him up, and the shutter speed was fast enough that the ambient light didn't get a chance to illuminate him while the shutter was open. The only light that was able to influence his exposure was the flash, and he was swinging back and forth pretty good. So the second shot was taken at 1/4 of a second, so a lot slower. It gave the ambient light more time to illuminate him, and therefore the result is this large ghosting issue. So kind of cool, really, but maybe not what you're going for. So the third shot was taken at 1/15th of a second. And you can see that there's quite a bit of difference between the first shot and the last shot, with only 1/5 of a second differential, but it's not as extreme as the 1/4 of a second. You just have to take a couple of test shots first to determine what you want, but it also depends on how fast the subject is moving as well. If you're going to be slowing down the shutter speed to increase the ambient light, you'd better be looking for something a little more creative or artistic. Now, we know that increasing the ISO creates more noise, but so does increasing the length of your exposure. There's actually a big, long technical explanation for noise, but as long as you understand that slow shutter speeds will increase noise as well as higher ISOs, you're good. The noise can also look a little different depending on whether it was caused by a slow shutter speed or a high ISO. Just know that your camera's limits, or know your camera's limits by taking a large number of test shots in different lighting situations. Personally, I prefer to use higher ISOs than slower shutter speeds. Really, it's the extreme end of either one that causes issues, such as like 1600 ISO or shutter speeds of less than 1/15th of a second. You really won't see the noise anything in between. So however, some cameras will take amazing low noise photographs at 3200 ISO or even higher. So the long and the short of it is that by setting your camera on aperture priority while using flash, you're telling your camera to expose for the ambient light. You do that all the time anyway. The only difference is that your flash is turned on and it's going to help expose your subject better, which is closer to the lens. If your shutter speed is going to be too slow, just increase your ISO. Your flash will do all the thinking for you when it's in TTL mode, provided your flash is one of the same brand as your camera, or at least one that will talk to your camera. The two have to be able to communicate in order for these scenarios to work properly. So the moral of this story is that, in my opinion anyway, you're really better off adjusting the ISO to allow for more ambient light so that you can keep the shutter speed up. The problem with that is noise at higher ISO values, but the cameras are, they're just getting so much better all the time, and we're able to use higher ISOs without getting the noise. So it really will just depend on how big you want to print that photo later and how high you have to go with the ISO to achieve a good amount of ambient light. So anyways, hopefully this was really, really helpful for you. And that is all for now.